Berlin, 14 November 1941. A boiler room beneath a munitions works on the eastern edge of the city. All cast iron and coal dust and the low roar of a furnace that never quite goes out. A stoker crouches by the coal store, shovel in hand, when something small and gray and unmoving catches the corner of his eye. A dead rat curled amongst the coal as though it crawled there to die in the warmth. He nudges it with his boot. Stiff, cold, ordinary in every visible respect. He picks it up by the tail, the way any man who has worked around vermin his whole life would do without a second thought, and with an easy flick of the wrist he tosses it into the firebox. He does not know it yet, but in that half-second, in that careless, habitual gesture repeated in boiler rooms the length and breadth of the Reich 1,000 times a week, an entire branch of Allied secret warfare is holding its breath, because that rat is not what it appears to be. Somewhere inside its cavity, wrapped in wax paper and pressed into the space where its organs used to sit, is a charge of plastic explosive fitted with a detonator primed to the heat of an open flame. If it works as designed, the boiler does not merely fail. It ruptures. It kills the men standing near it. It stops production in a war factory for days, perhaps weeks, and it does so without a single soldier, saboteur, or aircraft ever having to cross into hostile territory. This is not the imagining of a novelist. This is a real weapon, conceived in the English countryside by men who understood that war is not only won by the largest armies or the heaviest bombs, but sometimes by the smallest and strangest ideas that nobody thinks to guard against. The exploding rat was built by Britain's Special Operations Executive, the wartime organization Winston Churchill instructed to set Europe ablaze, and it stands today as one of the more curious entries in the long history of unconventional warfare. It never, so far as the surviving record shows, killed a single German soldier by fire, and yet, as we shall see, it may have done more damage to the German war effort than if it had. To understand why a group of serious-minded scientists and engineers, operating under the authority of the British government, spent time and money creating a dead rodent packed with high explosive, you have to go back to the darkest and most desperate stretch of the war, when Britain stood almost entirely alone, and when the only way to strike back at an occupying power was to think in ways the enemy would never think to defend against. That is where our story properly begins, and it is a story about ingenuity born from necessity, about a secret organization few in Britain even knew existed, and about how something as small and unremarkable as a dead rat became, briefly, an instrument of psychological war on an industrial scale. If you enjoy stories from the stranger corners of the Second World War, stick with this one, because what happened after these devices were built is far more interesting than the device itself. By the summer of 1940, Britain's position was, in the coldest possible terms, precarious. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been pulled off the beaches at Dunkirk with its equipment abandoned on French sand. The Soviet Union was, for the moment, tied to Germany by a pact of convenience, and the United States remained neutral, its material support flowing but its soldiers nowhere near a European battlefield. Britain could not, in 1940 or for some years afterward, mount any large-scale invasion of the continent. It did not have the men, the landing craft, or the industrial capacity to do so, and everyone in Whitehall knew it. What Britain did have in occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and eventually much further afield, was a scattered population of people who hated their occupiers and wanted, desperately, to do something about it. The trouble was that resistance without training, without tools, and without coordination tends to be futile and often fatal. A farmer with a shotgun cannot derail a train. A factory worker with a grudge cannot bring down a bridge. What these people needed was expertise, equipment, and a way of striking that did not require them to look their enemy in the eye and lose. Conventional sabotage had obvious limits. Blowing up a rail line required explosives that were difficult to conceal. detonators that could be traced to their source, and timing that depended on getting close enough to a heavily guarded target to plant a device and then escape before it went off. German security services were not fools. By 1941, the Gestapo and the Abwehr had become highly practiced at searching factories, checking deliveries, inspecting coal stores, and interrogating anyone who behaved suspiciously near a target of military value. Traditional explosives, however cleverly hidden in a briefcase or a lunch pail, could be found by a thorough search, and a thorough search was precisely what German industrial security had become very good at conducting. There was also a numbers problem. SOE could train and insert only so many agents into occupied Europe, and every agent sent in was an agent who might be captured, tortured, and forced to give up networks, safe houses, and other operatives. Every kilogram of explosive smuggled in by parachute or fishing boat was a kilogram that might be discovered in a raid. The war of sabotage was, in the driest sense, a war of probabilities, and Britain needed to find ways of tilting those probabilities in its favor without adding more men and more risk to an already overstretched clandestine network. What was required, then, was not simply more explosive, but a different category of it altogether, something that did not look like a weapon at all, that a search party would walk straight past without a second glance, that could be left in place by an ordinary civilian with no training and no nerve of steel, and that would find its own way into precisely the sort of place British planners wanted destroyed. It needed to exploit something the Germans could not simply search their way around, because it was not hiding in a crate or a wall cavity. It needed to hide inside something the enemy would dispose of themselves, using their own hands, without ever imagining that the object itself was the danger. This is the problem that landed in early 1941 on the desks of a group of scientists working at a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire, and their solution would turn out to be as strange as it was, in its own way, brilliant. The organization responsible was Section 15 of Britain's Special Operations Executive, more usually known to history by the address of its main research and development site. The Frythe, a Victorian manor house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, requisitioned from its owners in 1939 and turned into what staff referred to, with a certain dry British understatement, as Station 9. It was here that a collection of chemists, engineers, and, in the words of one veteran of the program, backroom boys with an unhealthy imagination, designed the extraordinary catalogue of gadgets that gave SOE its reputation as Churchill's toy shop. The man most closely associated with the exploding rat idea was a scientist attached to Station 9, whose job, in essence, was to look at everyday objects the enemy would never think twice about and ask a single, deceptively simple question. What if this ordinary thing were not ordinary at all? Dead rats, it turned out, were everywhere in wartime Europe, and nobody thought twice about finding one near a boiler, a coal store, or a rubbish heap, because rats congregate wherever there is warmth and food, and industrial premises had both in abundance. The design itself was straightforward in concept, however unusual in substance. Real dead rat carcasses, obtained in bulk, were used as the outer shell. The internal organs were removed, and the cavity was packed with a charge of plastic explosive, the same malleable, putty-like substance developed for other SOE sabotage work, molded to fit within the confines of a rat's body cavity, which is to say a modest charge, perhaps in the order of a few dozen grams, small by the standards of conventional demolition charges, but entirely sufficient to rupture a boiler under pressure or to touch off a fire in a confined space packed with coal dust and fuel. A simple detonator, designed to be triggered by heat rather than by a timer or a tripwire, was fitted so that the moment the carcass was thrown onto hot coals or into an open firebox, as any sensible stoker clearing his boiler room of vermin would do without thinking, the charge would detonate. The genius of the design, if genius is the right word for something built from dead rodents, lay entirely in its psychology rather than its engineering. The explosive charge itself was unremarkable. What made the device work was the fact that it exploited an action the enemy would take entirely on his own initiative, using his own labor, without any need for an agent to plant it in a guarded location. A saboteur did not need to break into a factory. He needed only to leave a dead rat somewhere a German worker was likely to find it and dispose of it in the ordinary way, which in a coal-fired industrial boiler room meant one thing above all: into the fire. Roughly 100 of these rat bombs were reportedly produced at Station 9, though, as with much of SOE's work, precise figures remain difficult to verify, since so many records were destroyed or never kept in detail to begin with, given the extreme sensitivity of the program. What is documented, from the accounts of those involved, is that a batch of the devices was prepared for shipment into occupied Europe in late 1941, intended for distribution to resistance contacts who could place them in factories, particularly in and around industrial centers where coal-fired boilers were common and access to coal stores by ordinary workers was unremarkable and unsupervised. And then, in one of those turns that make real history stranger than fiction, the entire consignment was intercepted before it ever reached its intended targets. A shipment of the devices, dispatched by parachute drop, was captured by German security forces who quickly worked out precisely what they were looking at. This should, by any reasonable measure, have been the end of the story. A clever idea, tried once, caught immediately, and quietly abandoned. Instead, what happened next turned an intercepted shipment of joke shop sabotage into one of the more effective psychological weapons of the entire secret war, and it happened almost entirely by accident. According to accounts that circulated after the war, drawing on statements attributed to SOE officers and to post-war interviews with those close to the program, when German authorities discovered the explosive rats, the reaction inside German industrial security circles was one of considerable alarm, precisely because the devices had been intercepted rather than detonated. If the enemy had built 100 of these things, the obvious and entirely reasonable question for any competent security officer was, how many more are already inside German factories, and how would anyone know? This is where the exploding rat, whatever its practical shortcomings as a delivery mechanism for explosive, achieved something rather remarkable. German factory managers, plant security officers, and boiler room supervisors across occupied and home territory were reportedly ordered to treat every dead rat found near industrial premises as a potential explosive device, rather than being thrown carelessly onto the coals. As centuries of habit dictated, dead vermin now had to be reported, inspected, and in many cases handled with extreme caution before disposal. Time that would otherwise have gone into running boilers, maintaining machinery, and keeping production lines moving was instead diverted into rat inspections, false alarms, and a background hum of anxiety that, by its very nature, never fully went away. Because the one thing you cannot search your way out of is uncertainty about which ordinary object might not be ordinary at all. What is important to be honest about here is the gap between documented fact and repeated wartime legend. The Corps claims that Station 9 designed and built exploding rat carcasses, that a shipment was intercepted by German forces, and that German industrial security subsequently issued instructions treating dead rats with suspicion, rest on post-war testimony from SOE personnel, and on accounts that have been repeated in numerous histories of the organization since, including reference in post-war British intelligence retrospectives. Contemporary German documentation explicitly corroborating an official rat inspection order has proven difficult for historians to independently verify in the original German archival record, and some historians treat the more colorful embellishments of the story, including specific claims about training courses or lengthy memoranda, devoted entirely to rodent inspection, with appropriate caution. What can be said with confidence is that the device was real, that it was built and prepared for operational use, and that the story of its psychological afterlife, however it may have been polished with retelling over the decades, reflects a genuine and well-documented principle of the secret war, that an intercepted weapon can sometimes do more damage to enemy morale and enemy man-hours than a weapon that is never found at all. If you are enjoying this journey into the stranger corners of the secret war, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might think, and it costs nothing but a click. Right, back to the rats. It is worth pausing here to place the exploding rat alongside its rivals and its cousins in other secret laboratories of the war, because Britain was not alone in seeing the potential of disguised or concealed sabotage devices, even if the particular approach of using an actual animal carcass appears to have been a distinctly British contribution to the field. Germany's own Abwehr, and later its intelligence services, developed a range of disguised explosive devices of their own, hidden inside everyday objects such as tins of food, lumps of coal, and thermos flasks, the coal bomb in particular being a close cousin in concept, since it too relied on an object being shoveled unthinkingly into a firebox by someone with no reason to suspect it. The difference was one of camouflage rather than mechanism. A lump of explosive packed coal looks, to the naked eye, exactly like every other lump of coal in the scuttle, whereas a dead rat is, by its nature, an object that draws attention precisely because nobody wants it there. And it was this very unpleasantness, this instinct to get rid of the thing as quickly and as thoughtlessly as possible, that the British design exploited so effectively. American sabotage efforts developed later in the war largely through the Office of Strategic Services in cooperation with, and often directly informed by, British experience at Station 9, produced their own catalog of concealed devices, including explosives disguised as lumps of coal, as animal droppings intended for use against pack animals and vehicles on rougher terrain, and a range of demolition charges shaped to resemble innocuous debris. What set the British approach apart, and what historians of unconventional warfare tend to highlight when discussing Station 9's output more broadly, was less the sophistication of any single device and more the sheer range of the imaginative catalog on offer, spanning everything from exploding rats to explosive-filled artificial coal to devices disguised as rubbish worth destroying. It was less a single triumphant weapon than an entire philosophy of asking, again and again, what ordinary object could be turned against the very habits of trust and routine that occupied populations relied upon to get through their working day. The verdict of history on the exploding rat, then, is a curious one, because it succeeded not through what it was built to do, but through what happened when it failed to do it. As a purely destructive weapon it was, on the evidence available, a failure, since the consignment intended for distribution was captured before it ever reached a single German boiler room, and, so far as any surviving record indicates, no version of the device is documented as having actually detonated inside an enemy target. And yet, if the post-war accounts from those who worked at Station 9 and within SOE more broadly are to be believed, and treated with the appropriate caveat that some of the finer detail may have grown in the telling over 80 years of retelling, the psychological ripple caused by its interception achieved something a successful explosion might never have managed. A persistent, low-grade anxiety embedded into the daily routine of German industrial security, a wariness about the most mundane objects imaginable, and hours upon hours of vigilance poured into inspecting something that, in the overwhelming majority of cases, really was nothing more than a dead rat. This is, in miniature, one of the enduring lessons of the entire secret war, and it is a lesson that outlived the exploding rat by decades, informing later Cold War thinking about deception, misdirection, and the disproportionate value of making an adversary doubt his own environment. You do not need to kill the enemy to defeat him. Sometimes it is enough to make him afraid of his own coal store. The device itself left almost no physical trace. No exploding rat survives in any museum collection, for the simple and rather grim reason that its components, being organic, do not preserve, and the few examples ever built appear to have been either used, destroyed in testing, or lost entirely to time. What does survive, held today by institutions such as the Imperial War Museum in London alongside the wider collection of Station 9 gadgetry, from silenced pistols disguised as everyday tools to explosive devices shaped as lumps of coal and other innocuous debris, is the broader material and documentary record of the toy shop that built it. The sketches, the design philosophy, the testimony of the men and women who worked there, and the enduring reputation of a small country house in Hertfordshire that quietly did more to shape 20th century unconventional warfare than its modest architecture ever suggested it could. The influence of Station 9's approach can be traced forward into the post-war era with reasonable confidence, even where individual devices like the rat did not themselves see further development. The broader concept of disguising a weapon inside an object the enemy will handle and dispose of using his own unthinking habits fed directly into Cold War-era tradecraft, into the design of concealed listening devices, disguised dead-drop containers, and a whole vocabulary of deception that intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain would spend the next half-century refining. Somewhere in the lineage of the fake rock used to hide a radio transmitter, or the hollow coin used to smuggle microfilm, sits the same essential insight that a dead rat in a Hertfordshire laboratory first proved in miniature. An object beneath suspicion is worth more than an object built to withstand it. So let us return, as we promised at the outset, to that boiler room in the closing weeks of 1941, to the stoker with his shovel and his easy, unthinking flick of the wrist, because it is here that the entire strange story comes back into focus. In the version of events that was actually recorded, of course,